Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Today's guest is Dale Lucas, author of the Sword and Sorcery and Police procedural series, The Fifth Ward, and the historical urban fantasy series, the Doc Voodoo series. He's here with us to discuss his adventures in writing historical fantasy. But before we dive in, tell us a bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
So, what we're drinking here, we had discussed coming up with a new cocktail, and since we've both written stuff in the 1920s, and gin was kind of the cocktail of the moment, or the libation of the moment back then, we discussed using that as our base. So I did 2 ounces of gin, 3/4 ounces of Benedictine, 3/4 ounces of some kind of orange liqueur, Cointreau, Grand Marnier, orange curacao, whatever you prefer, couple dashes of Angostura bitters, couple dashes of orange bitters, and then an orange peel to garnish. And I have to say, I think we did a great job. It came out pretty well.
I think so too. I'm super impressed. This is a tasty one. I'll have to keep this one around in the collection.
Excellent.
All right, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
I have basically been writing for a really long time. I've been writing seriously and trying to get published since about 1998, but I only actually got something out in the world and published in 2011.
Okay.
And that's the first Doc Voodoo book, Aces and Eights, which was published by a small press called Beating Windward Press. Before that, I had written probably 3 full-length novels, 1 a straight fantasy and 2 with historical settings and fantasy elements, and none of them I'd gotten close on publishing them a couple times, but nothing ever quite happened. Doc Voodoo was kind of where I finally got things out in the world a bit. And my first big fantasy publication for a Big 5 publisher was the Fifth Ward series, which was the first book of which, First Watch, was released by Orbit Books in 2017. So that's kind of my professional CV, so to speak. But basically, I've just been writing for a really long time. I've written several books that haven't been published. I've written mountains of screenplays that never got produced. I did for a time live in Los Angeles and try to get somewhere as a screenwriter, and that did not work. Eventually everything kind of came together and went where it needed to go. But yeah, I just love telling stories, and I especially love pulling from the past, even if I'm doing something that's straight fantasy, because I feel like reality has a heft and a weight, and sometimes even an oddness and a curiosity that something that you just make up doesn't even have.
Talk more about that. So what is it that draws you to historical fiction? Like, we're both historical fiction writers, and there's definitely, like, I know I feel a pull, but what's that pull for you?
I think when you get right down to it, one of my favorite pastimes is traveling. And I've been very fortunate, and I've gotten to travel to a lot of places, but I feel like I've never gone to enough places. And there are still scores and scores of other places I'd like to go. Reading is one of my modes of travel. And that goes for if it's a real place or a historical place or a completely fantastic or made up place. So that's really where the attraction comes from, I think, is that I love in my imagination to travel somewhere. And while I absolutely want a good story and I absolutely want great characters, one of the third thing that I always want is a really strong sense of place and atmosphere. I try really hard basically to make the settings of my stories become a character in and of themselves.
And so, kind of looking deeper into that, are there any reasons you specifically chose the genres you did to pair with your historical fiction?
Again, it's probably just my natural inclinations. I've always been a fantasy kid. I was always into fantasy, sci-fi, and horror as a youngster. actually leaning more towards like horror, fantasy, sci-fi, probably in that order. And I love it when fantasy and horror just kind of mingle with each other. My impulse is always, oh yeah, that, but make it scarier or make it darker. So it was just kind of natural that, and it was funny. For a lot of years when I was writing, it never occurred to me to try to seek out or recreate a historical setting. But then the first time I decided to do it, it was actually on a book that has still never been published, set during the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, called The Serpent and the Eagle. Research for a totally different thing I wanted to write, which was a contemporary vampire story. And I had this notion of a character who had been around since the conquistadors conquered Mexico. So I was like, but I don't know anything about the Aztecs, so let me read on that. I started reading about Aztec culture, which I had never dipped into before. And the next thing I knew, I was just falling down this rabbit hole. And after getting all this great information, I was like, oh, well, cool. Let me write like a novella or a short story that's going to be just about this character's origin. And then I wrote that, and it kept expanding and expanding. And lo and behold, I ended up with a 500-page book a couple years later.
Oh, I know how that goes.
But that was the beginning of it. That was when I really like dove headfirst into the whole historical research thing and really got kind of drunk on it. I mean, I just loved it. And especially when I think the other thing that helped was with that time and place, central Mexico in the early 16th century, that was a culture that I'd heard little things here and there on National Geographic shows or whatever, but I'd never really studied it. And when I found out the extent of the civilization that existed there and how sophisticated it was and how crazy and advanced in some ways and stunted in other ways, and it was just the most amazing thing I had ever come in contact with. And it was all real history.
Yeah.
It wasn't even something somebody made up. And I think that just was like a light going on that made me go, oh, history's full of these great dark corners and things you can learn that you never knew before. And yeah, since then it's pretty much become my thing I'm going to take this historical setting that I think is cool, and I'm going to throw something fantastic and horrifying in there and run with that.
Yeah. I'm right there with you when it comes to the, you're drunk on the research. It can be almost a fire hose at times.
Oh yeah.
And you can't let go because if you've got any drive to, strive for accuracy in the historical writing, you just have to be there and you have to dig deep and you can't stop. And even when you should stop, you can't stop.
Oh yeah. It's totally true too. I've tried to develop this habit of, I usually have a long lead up period to when I start writing something. I do a lot of development first. Even if it's not something strictly historical, I tend to like to think about things a long time before actually doing them. And, but I've tried to get into the habit of saying you don't have to know everything to get started. Yeah. Like you have to know as much as you need to know to just orient a few things, get ideas on a few characters and go with that. And the rest of it, you'll figure out as you go. But it's really easy to decide that when you go down that rabbit hole, you're like, oh, a little deeper, just a little deeper. I'm sure I'll find the thing I'm after if I keep looking.
I fall into that trap very easily. It's something I have to really be mindful of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a book I'm working on now, an original thing that I've been working on off and on between other projects for like 2.5 years now. And it's getting closer to completion. I'm hoping to have it out and being shopped around before the end of this year. Hopefully by the summer, but we'll see how that goes. But it's set in the 1920s in New York, which is a setting I've been in before with the Doc Voodoo books. I know an awful lot about it already, and yet I still find myself constantly digging for things and looking for things and trying to get a better idea of, things I hadn't thought of before, and it never stops.
Well, and thinking about your 1920s Doc Voodoo setting, one question I'm actually really curious about is how the fantasy affects the setting. Because I know from my own book, historical fantasy set in the 20s, for me, it's very much solely a filter. Like my 1920s world is the 1920s world.
Yes.
With these other events happening and these other slight tweaks, but
it's hidden stuff behind the. You're not doing full on like alternate history or something like that.
Exactly.
You're doing what I have sometimes called secret history.
Sure. Yeah.
One of my favorite authors is a guy named Tim Powers, who he's written a lot of books. And I first heard the term secret history used in connection with his writing. And he tends to do the same thing. I discovered him after I started doing it. And then I was like, oh, look, here's someone who does what I want to do. And they do it extremely well.
I see. So you do the secret history thing too, then?
Yes. It's, okay. I want it same like with Doc Voodoo. I wanted it to be, this is the 20s. It's the 20s we know. This magical stuff is happening, but it's kind of on the down low. And I considered it sometimes because I was inspired by old pulp fiction and stuff like that. I did think about sometimes creating an alternate hyper reality that involved some of those crazy elements, but still kept other things hidden. Like I remember specifically thinking that if I ever got to a certain point in the series, I wanted to offhandedly mention that someone brought a giant gorilla to the city and it was lying on Park Avenue or whatever. It is some sort of like sidebar thing. But like magic, for instance, is not a thing that everybody in New York City knows about. It's a thing that a few select people know about and use to their advantage. And one of the things I even did in Aces and Eights was I tried to show that people who are in the know, including people in the criminal underworld, they can go to special places and they can meet special people who have these special abilities, and that gives them a different arsenal of weapons to use against their enemies and whatnot. I still try to keep it more or less as it's history as we know it. This is just something crazy intruding on it momentarily.
Now, does that technique translate into your more purely fantastical writing, like with the Fifth Ward?
Yes, because with the Fifth Ward, my initial, for those who don't know, but the basic pitch on the Fifth Ward is it's like a cop buddy movie, Lethal Weapon, 48 hours, take your pick, but set in a medieval-esque fantasy world, in a big teeming city named Yanara. That's a place where all these different races, humans, orcs, elves, dwarves, they all come there to do business and whatever. And it's basically the story of two guys who are a human and a dwarf who are watchmen, and they just patrol the city streets. They get involved in shenanigans. They solve mysteries, stuff of that nature. And when I set out to write that, even though it was going to be a classic fantasy setting, one of the things I was really excited about was I had all these crazy little factoids about urban living throughout history in my head from the many things I had read and researched, whether it was ancient Rome or whether it was the Aztecs or whether it was, Renaissance era Italy. I had all these things in my head, and it was like, I can just use it all. And I don't have to be limited by history or location or anything. I can just pull whatever I want to pull and use it however I want to pull it, or use it, rather. So, yeah, it does definitely inform it.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You have all of, this massive bag of tricks at your disposal, just ready to go.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that also helps keep the fantasy world grounded because you're pulling from real details constantly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's part of that's the challenge, is you want to create this place in your book it's just made of words on a page. But when somebody reads it, they really feel like they're there.
Yeah.
You've got that great combination of atmospherics and sensory input without bogging things down, without slowing the narrative down, but you're giving people just the right things in the right combination to sort of bring it all to life in their heads. And that's part of the challenge too, is learning to get that information across and telegraph that stuff without bogging people down in it.
Yeah.
That's its own challenge.
All right, back to our cocktail for a second.
All right.
One thing that I always really try to focus on in my own writing is trying to include those taste and smell details because they're so often overlooked.
Yep.
And so let's think about those details now with the cocktail. What sort of tastes and smells? What notes do you get out of this cocktail when you drink it?
Well, being gin based, you've got that herbal thing. I used Plymouth gin to do mine.
Okay.
So it's got a slight citrusy thing to it already, very slight. But you know how gin is. It's a little more stringent,
Yeah.
almost medicinal. And then, but the Benedictine then adds this sort of warming, this sort of spicy, almost like autumn winterish
Yeah,
thing
absolutely.
to it that kind of darkens it and warms it up. And then you've got the oranges in there to brighten things and sweeten things. Um, so you end up with this. You actually mentioned when we were talking about this beforehand, how it gives you that winter feeling. And I remember thinking like, God, this would be good with like some roast duck and some
Yeah,
nice like oven roasted root vegetables and sweet potatoes or something like that. Like it would go perfectly with a dinner like that.
absolutely. Yeah, it definitely has that October to March vibe going.
Yes. Yeah.
And it has that like really, really pleasant chest burn. Like
Mhm.
not the you just drank whiskey too fast burn, but that
Yeah. Not the
nice,
whoa.
the
Easy
slow
there.
spreading warmth.
Yeah. Yeah. Even my wife liked it. I let her try it, and she's not a big fan of gin or gin cocktails.
Mm,
She's very choosy about them. So she was happy with this one, though.
nice, nice. Yeah, gin is definitely one of those drinks where if it ain't for you, it's not for you.
Yeah. I've slowly developed a taste for it. And I've found that a lot of the times it's just different brands. There are
Yeah.
some brands I really like Plymouth. I really like Aviation.
Mhm.
I don't know. Can we mention brand names on here? My bad.
Oh,
But yeah, no, I have certain brands I prefer. And when we were talking about preparing for this, I mentioned how I love Aviations.
mhm.
That's one of my favorite cocktails. Which when I discovered it, I saw a picture of it in a bar's menu, and they described it, and I'm like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
But it looks delightful. I'll give it a shot. And yeah, it's one of my favorites now.
Speaking of an aviation, one tweak you should try
Yeah.
is substitute the lemon juice
Hmm.
for limoncello.
Ooh.
It
Actually,
mellows out that bite a little bit more.
that's true because the lemon juice is often a little it's a little hardcore.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
sometimes I almost want to mix my lemon juice with a little water to
Hmm.
calm it down some. But yeah, limoncello, that would be great.
Yeah,
I'm definitely
it
going to
still
do that.
serves the same purpose, but it just gives it that nice, slightly more mellow
Yeah.
approach, I guess you could say.
Well, and this kind of circles back to what you're talking about creating atmosphere and sensory
Absolutely.
details. I in my writing, I write about food and drink a lot. Um, I had people like total strangers who didn't know. My friends don't need to be reminded of this. They all know I'm a foodie and I love this stuff and I'll talk about it endlessly. But it was cool when I would see strangers mention online or when people even ask me, "Oh yeah, whenever you talk about when they're sitting in a bar and they're drinking some warm thing on a cold night and the way you describe it, it's so amazing. I just want to be sitting there like sipping that thing with them." Like it's like exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I was going for.
I do a lot with drink. Eating is something I actually need to practice more. I have a harder time because with eating, people tend to be stationary,
Yes.
whereas they can be up and mobile with the drink. And so
Yeah.
I personally need to practice a little bit more with that, keeping the energy up while people are seated and eating.
Yeah. It's well, that's its own thing, but yeah, I keep joking that if I could figure out a way to like write a fantasy novel about like a chef, and I'm not a
Oh, yeah.
trained chef. I'm just a guy who loves food and drink. But if I could find a way to like weaponize that and actually work that into a story somewhere, I'd be set because I could do that endlessly.
So my next question actually kind of spins off of my own struggle talk. Uh, what do you find are some of your personal challenges when it comes to writing historical fiction? Because as much as I love writing historical fiction, I also loathe it. It's the best thing and the bane of my existence all at once. And so I'm just curious, what have been some of the real major hurdles for you?
Well, it makes you nervous because there's always somebody out there who's going to read it and they know more about that thing than you do.
Yeah.
And they're going to read it and they're going to go, oh, this guy obviously didn't do his research. Doesn't matter how obscure of a detail it might be.
Yeah.
You know that person's out there and you're trying to write in such a way that that person will be satisfied. But you still know they're going to be there and say something at some point. So there's that. Or there's dealing with the foibles of the past, the unpleasant things about the past. I mean, writing about the 1920s is a really actually, when I wrote Doc Voodoo, I probably was not even realizing what a challenge I was setting myself up for. But I tried really hard to. One of the hallmarks of the series is that, and there's only 2 books in it, but because it's the 1920s and that was a time when racial sensitivity in America was at an all-time low, and because it's set in Harlem and mostly is concerned with Black characters trying to sort of protect their community from the outside. Then I sort of let the racial language fly free. And I tried to modulate it during editing and bring it back into line. But the whole point was it seemed to me to be a time when nobody really cared what anybody else thought about anything. And Black America certainly had reason to feel threatened and to feel othered in a major way.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of I remember reading a review for another book and thinking that's the review I wish somebody would write for this, where they talked about that and said it's supposed to hurt. Every time somebody uses one of those words or racial epithets, like it's supposed to hurt. It's supposed to be like a punch to the gut. And the fact that it happens again and again and again is supposed to be reminding you that you're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah.
Like the past, what's the famous quote? The past is a different country or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's exactly that. So dealing with those things can be a minefield, but you just kind of have to
Absolutely.
do your research, try to approach it with humility and with a sense of real respect, and do the best you can.
Yeah. I found that's one thing I find really, really tricky as well is so often with issues of race or other social issues in a story, it's hard to find that balance of honoring it and doing it justice without making the story about it, because it's such a heavy topic.
Yes.
It needs to be addressed, but if that's not the goal of the story, it can't be the goal of the story. So how do you strike that balance?
Exactly. No, it's very difficult. Actually, I just had a momentary thought of another thing that tied into this, and then the thought just went whoosh and flew away. But it's totally true that it's a tough thing to handle, and you always have to keep the story in the forefront.
Yeah.
You have to keep thinking, what are we here for? What's the conflict here? What's happening with these people? Oh, I remembered what the thing was. It was the notion of people behaving in a way or expressing thoughts that might seem to some readers to be anachronistic or not necessarily part of the era you're writing in.
Yeah.
And I've gotten in a number of arguments with friends of mine who have different ideas about these things, who have talked about, oh, well, like when I hear somebody I see this medieval movie and this guy talks about how he doesn't believe in, slavery or bondage, as in terms of like a serf or something like that to their master. And it just strikes me as totally wrong. And my feeling is always, there's probably been somebody in every era,
Yeah.
in every place, who didn't think like everybody else in that place. As long as you can acknowledge that everybody else thinks that person is off their rocker, you can have them go ahead and express those thoughts, no matter how anachronistic they might be, because chances are there was somebody like that. There was a dissenter who was like, yeah, I know this is what we do, but I don't think we should be doing that. I think that's a really bad idea.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too that you talk about that, about kind of audience perception of anachronisms. One of the things that I find so interesting is where people place swear words in time.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the young swear words are like 250 years old.
Right.
There's very few that are actually modern.
Yes.
And most are ancient. And so it's fascinating because most people would be like, well, they dropped an F-bomb in this medieval movie. I can't believe they did that. And it's like, well, when did you think that started? It wasn't the 1940s.
And even if it wasn't that literal word, there was an equivalent. Absolutely. I guarantee you, in every language, in every culture, through the entire history of human existence, there has been an equivalent for what we have as swear words.
Absolutely.
So since you're writing in English for an English-speaking audience in this era, and these are the words they understand, use them because they get the point across. I always thought Rome on HBO did a great job with that, mixing up modern stuff with stuff that was of the era. Like I remember them having people say cack over and over again when they actually meant shit. Because in Latin, cac was actually the word for shit. Nice. And just that simple thing, mingling those two things in there, made it all just flow so much better. Well,
and Rome's an excellent example because the graffiti they turn up, and
yes,
it's big cities doing big city things and having big city problems. I mean, that's timeless.
All through time, it's actually kind of amazing how little it's changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So along those lines, I'm thinking about those little details real quickly. What was your most troubling, difficult detail to find?
Oh gosh.
In research, like I have the one single one where I was just like, I should just not include it. It's so stupid. It's so pointless. But I didn't. I kept going until I could find something and use it.
I mean, I can get, and very often they're not even that important. It's something that I decide I need to know this and I want to know this. Right now, the book I'm working on that's set in the 20s in New York, something I'd never thought about with Doc Voodoo, but that has entered my consciousness now is streetcars. The 20s were this time where basically every mode of transportation was happening all at the same time. So you had horse-drawn carts, although they were on their way out, they were still around.
Yeah.
You had individual automobiles, you had trucks, you had passenger buses, you had streetcars, you had a subway, you had an elevated train. It was all there. Yeah. And I have sometimes tried to work really hard to figure out exactly what streets, like I know which streets the elevated trains were on, but I don't know exactly which streets had streetcar lines. And sometimes I know if I dug really hard, maybe I could find those, but I'm like, just don't. Yeah. Just say they heard a streetcar. That's fine. It's okay.
I spent weeks. My main culprit was I spent weeks trying to figure out what cab fare in Paris would have been.
Oh, yes. I actually,
I had to have the guy pay the cabbie.
Yep.
What's he going to pay him? And it would have been so easy to just gloss over it and have him throw some money and it would have been fine, but I couldn't. No! I just couldn't do it.
I understand. I totally get that. And I know I've done it before. I just can't remember any of the past versions because the one I've been working on lately is the one that's closest in my consciousness, but I've totally had that issue before where I've stressed out over tiny little details that nobody would notice even if I just made it up. But I'm like, no, I need to know.
What are some of your favorite details? Like the little nuggets where you're just like, oh, I'm saving this forever. This one's going in the mental bank.
Well, one of the things I learned about ancient Rome, and It didn't come up in a book that I wrote that never got published, set in Roman occupied Alexandria in the 2nd century. But I used it in the Fifth Ward, which is the tenements and the apartment buildings had barrels in at the bottom where everybody would dump their chamber pots. And then there were people whose whole job it was to come around at night with carts and barrels of their own and collect all the effluvia in those collection barrels and then take it away to be used for industrial purposes. They would use urine in tanning leather. They would sell the excrement to farmers and whatnot. But so at night there were these guys taking shit carts all around the place. And I ended up in the second Fifth Ward book, I open it with a scene involving that uses those shit carts as a plot point.
Oh, nice.
So I was like, yeah, that's awesome. I love stuff like that. I love crazy little details. It sort of goes back to when we were talking earlier about trying to recreate the past or thinking of the past as a place to travel to or being surprised at these civilizations that you never knew existed. I've even found it with things that we think are familiar, like medieval Europe or the Old West, where when you really read about what life was like in those places or in specific places during those times, it was way more sophisticated and freewheeling. There was more to it than you think, you know. I used to honestly have this vision in my head from all the Westerns I had watched that people would just show up in the middle of the desert if they could find like a water source. They just show up and start building buildings in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And it's like, no, it didn't quite work like. And then whoever showed up could just build their own thing and, oh yeah, that's his land now. But it didn't work that way either. They would plat everything out. They would, people would buy things and sell things. And so I always find that filling in the facts of the past that you think you know is actually just as interesting as learning about something that you never knew about before.
That's a really good point. Yeah, the Old West is a great example of that too, because I feel like it's at once way more sophisticated, like you're saying, but then also way worse than anybody pictures, Yeah. In another episode, we were talking about this a little bit too, how just that the John Wayne vision of the West is so far.
Oh God, yes. Yeah.
Anything that it actually looked like.
I mean, good Lord, can you imagine how those people smelled? Oh. I even think that with the 20s thing that I'm writing now, because people living in New York City, 9/10 of them didn't have an actual bathtub.
Yeah.
Or showers. A shower was considered like a luxury item.
Well, and the ones who did have a bathtub were just making gin in it anyway, right?
Right, exactly. You gotta have somewhere to brew. You can't bathe in there. That's not gonna net you anything at the end of the day.
Let's talk a little bit about the drink. One thing we were going to do in this episode is we were going to try to come up for a name for it.
A name.
A name. So we know that we both agree it's wintry. It's got that the kind of heavy. Actually, funny enough, speaking of historical fiction details, one of my favorite pieces of research I have is a term for a winter warming drink in the 1920s was a quilt.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, that's one of those little nuggets that I just love. Yeah, so this is definitely a quilt.
Nice. It is absolutely that. And I was sort of thinking beforehand, like the Benedictine is a French ingredient. And I know radio is set in Paris, is it not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my brain was going to all kinds of French places. A French quilt. The Pigalle quilt, something like that. And by the way, you laughed. I know that you know what Pigalle is. So
I lived maybe like 5 blocks from there.
Oh, that's so cool. My wife and I visited there in 2015, and I made her go all the way out to. We wanted to go to the bar from Amelie.
Yeah, I lived a block and a half from that bar.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so we went there, and then I was like, oh, and I want to go to this address down on these other streets and down a dead end street. She's like, what is this? I'm like, it's a theater that used to be there but isn't there anymore. It's the Grand Guignol. which is now like a puppet theater or something like that. But yeah, I made her like walk down there just so I could say I've been down the street where the Grand Guignol used to be. But yeah, it was pretty funny walking around Pigalle for that day, because then we saw some what looked like probably American tourists with their kids and strollers. Yeah. And they were really thrown off by all the sex shops and the red light stuff that's around there.
That neighborhood has been that neighborhood for as long as that neighborhood has existed.
That's pretty outstanding that it's existed for like over 100 years and it's still that.
Oh yeah.
It never stopped.
I mean, the town is so dense. Everything's compartmentalized.
Yeah, it was an amazing trip. We really enjoyed it. It was still one of the best cities I've ever visited.
It's that neighborhood actually is really interesting because not only it's like party town and sex town, but it's also the main area of town where you would go to buy musical instruments.
Yeah, I remember passing all the music stores.
Yeah. A block off of that area is the fabric district. Wow. So all the grannies who want to make their new quilt would go through that. You know, it's just that happens to be where those things are.
See, yeah. So quilt needs to be in the name of this thing.
Okay.
And actually, and going back to the orange thing, just as associations go, I remember when we took a tour of the Opera Garnier, the lady giving the tour, who was French and Parisian, talked about how when she was a little girl, getting an orange for Christmas was a big deal. Like that was a luxury, and for somebody to give you that orange was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But yeah, what can we do?
We could use the French word for orange, except that it's just orange, so it doesn't change too much. But
the quilt l'orange.
Actually,
the quilt l'orange.
That's pretty great. I think that has to be.
Bam! I dubbed the quilt l'orange.
That is excellent.
I made a double batch, so I'm gonna pour a little more.
There it is. Nice.
Bam. That's funny.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
Yeah, I've enjoyed for this year. I don't know how it's been in Switzerland, but you know, we've pretty much stayed home for the last year over here because of COVID and stuff like that. And my wife and I, our favorite things to do were to go to restaurants and to hang out in bars. And we would often sit at the bar and eat there so we could talk to the bartenders. We had a few around town who would, we would love to have them just surprise us. You know how to just make me something. Yeah. Just make something up, whatever. So since I've been home this year and we haven't hardly been able to do any of that, then I've been making stuff up at home, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I do that a lot too. It's once you're willing to bite the bullet and grow the liqueur side of your bar enough, you can really expand into a lot. Yeah. I find that's the biggest roadblock for people is having those secondary ingredients, enough of them to really experiment.
Yeah, somebody asked me about that with the aviations. They're like, "Do you actually keep creme de violette around?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, I bought a bottle to make these, and it's going to be here until I use it all. I keep it in the fridge so it'll last as long as possible." But and I realize it's a totally ridiculous investment on my time, probably, but I just love the idea of having all this stuff here. It kind of goes back to the travel thing. The same way that food tells a story, a drink. I love the way a single thing in a glass can have all these different tasting notes and all these different things it can dig up in your psyche and in your imagination.
Absolutely.
And it does it all simultaneously.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's that's why I love doing it. I don't even really drink that much. I make like one drink a night. It's my thing at the end of the day that makes me feel better.
Little dessert. Well, and that's a really interesting point you bring up, because both with writing and with drinks or flavors really in general, but particularly drinks, it's making your brain create something that isn't actually there.
Yes.
So, I mean, obviously with this drink, the orange flavor is coming from oranges, but take something like a whiskey. Yeah. The apricot that you're picking up in that whiskey is not there in that whiskey, but that's how your brain is registering that signal. And with writing, it's like, here are some letters on some paper.
Yep. And you're having to throw those together
Yeah.
in some kind of, semi-literate free association, and somehow little black marks on a page turn into pictures in your brain.
Yeah, it's that mind control aspect of writing has always just been such a thrill.
It's awesome. It's a cool, and it's the thing that's always appealed to me with it. As a kid, I actually wasn't a big reader as a kid, mostly comic books. I didn't really start reading till I got to be 12 or 13 for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
That was the point when my mom said I could buy adult books. So once I could buy Stephen King books, then I was like, oh, I like this reading thing.
Yeah.
But
Clifford can only take you so far.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm always so jealous of kids these days with all of the amazing, like, young adult and even mid-grade stuff that there is out there to choose from. But it really is this magical thing. Like, you put words on a page and a person reads it, and 9 out of 10 people who read it, they may have slightly different pictures, but they're all making a picture that's in the same ballpark. And it's because you put the words there.
Okay, so here's another question, diving back into the historical side of things. What eras would you love to see explored more? I feel like with historical fiction, there's kind of, a big 5, maybe a big 10 of eras and places that actually get used, and then that's about it. So I'm curious.
Yes.
You mentioned the Aztec world before, but what is
that would be the first and foremost. I am still waiting for somebody to make a great Aztec film or a great Aztec miniseries. Like Apocalypto, that was Mayan, not Aztec, but it at least gives you the flavor. It's kind of the same, but not really. But it is this era that's just never been dealt with on film. At least I've found a few little obscure movies that kind of do it, but it's just never been done. And I remember the feeling of reading the books I read and then trying to explain it to other people. And I would be like, you don't understand. There were these huge cities with hundreds of thousands of people, and they were pristine white, and there were these giant pyramids. And it's like, it's something that in our brains, we don't know what that looks like. And I want to see, especially now with CGI and the ability that people have to recreate amazing things. I just want to see that recreated somewhere. But so that would be a big one. Let me see. Some of the ones I'm partial to are ones that already get quite a bit of coverage. I love Victorian England because clouds and smoke and tight little streets that probably smell horrible are just awesome from a writing standpoint. Ancient Rome gets plenty of play, although I love that too. Actually, that takes me back though to the one that I did that never got picked up, that takes place in Alexandria. The world of Alexandria specifically is a world that I would like to see treated more. It was handled very well in a movie called Agora with Rachel Weisz that came out probably about 2006, 2007. But it was an amazing city. And it was this crazy crossroads city that was part Egyptian and part Greek. And then when the Romans took over, it became part Roman, and there was a huge Jewish population there. So, they influenced the history of the place. And it was at its time probably even more cosmopolitan and alien to the people of that world than Rome itself probably was. That has always seemed like a place to me that more writers need to play in, But even if we're talking the Old West, get out of the Great Plains and the deserts. San Francisco in the 1860s or 70s would be a fantastic place for a writer to play around. It was such a crazy city. There was this great breadth of stuff happening from the lowest to the highest, incredibly glamorous in some ways and still absolutely gross and mud encrusted in others.
Yeah.
So
no, I'm with you. I mean, I grew up north of Portland and then adulted for 10 years in Seattle.
Yeah.
And I would love to see Gold Rush era Seattle done right.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We've got White Fang and a few other things, but there's
not quite the same thing.
And that's a scene. I think there's a lot that could be done there.
Yeah. Yeah. I have there's a project I still haven't gotten to do. It's a straight historical book that I'd like to write set during the Reconstruction era. The Civil War gets a lot of ink and lots of screen time, but I feel like the Reconstruction era that came after it from about 1865 to 1880, more important things happened in that era than happened during the war or immediately before it. Things that we're still dealing with today and paying the price for today. And I would love to see more authors and more storytellers deal with that era and the ramifications of the things that happened there, instead of constantly doing another movie about what an awesome General Lee was or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, same question, but instead of eras and places, what are some specific details or themes you think need to be explored more?
I am partial to, I feel in a way like fantasy should always be about power and how to use it, but I don't always feel like, and I feel like it's almost the de rigueur theme of all fantasy in a way, but I don't think that writers always approach that theme in the most interesting way possible.
Yeah.
So I think questions of power and how to use it, questions of how to reconcile opposing viewpoints that are both equally valid, not necessarily one that you can easily label as, okay, this is probably better and this is probably worse, but two that have legitimate, like, philosophical and practical points to make, and yet they're completely incompatible or seemingly so. Questions about how to reconcile those things. Reconciliation of opposites, I guess, would be a good one. That's another theme that I always find interesting. And the theme of how what you gain in power, you lose in control. So how being a powerful person in a given place and time is actually limiting rather than freeing. It creates this kind of prison of what's expected of you, what's required of you, all the people trying to use the power you wield for whatever they need, et cetera, things of that nature. So those are three off the top of my head.
That's great. Okay, let's pull back to our cocktail one last time.
Yes.
Now that we know that the Quilt L'Orange is in the world, what's the right move for it? If you were going to recommend this to somebody, if you were going to or maybe plan it for a night when we can actually get together with people again, and you were going to serve this, when would you serve it? What would you pair it with?
Well, as you suggested, it would probably be best as like a fall or winter cocktail. Although, since I live in Florida, I never get that.
Fair.
So we usually get like a week of winter, and we wait for like weeks of winter to show up a little bit at a time. But yeah, a nice, so when it's cool outside, it's gotten dark early. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it would go great with a roast duck, or maybe even I was trying to think if there was some seafood that would go with it, but I don't really know.
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, you know what? Scallops.
Scallops. Yes, this would go great with scallops. Scallops are an absolute good. Mm-hmm. So and I think this would work very well with it. But yeah, this has a very sort of Christmassy feel to it. I could argue that it could still be wonderful in the summertime because the citrusy thing and the fact that it's gin versus a heavier thing like whiskey means it's a little light and refreshing. So this might be a nice little sundown cocktail to have with tapas or something like that.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
It could work in that context. But at the end of the day, you drink what you want when you want.
Absolutely. That was was one of. I mean, I love Scotland for numerous reasons, but one of my favorite things was going to a distillery tour in Scotland, and they were very adamant. They're like, "Look, we sell whiskey. We want you to drink our whiskey. We absolutely do not care how you drink our whiskey. We just want you to drink it.
Just drink it."
It's like, you want it on ice, drink it on ice. You want it mixed with something, mix it with something. Just enjoy it. Have fun with it.
Absolutely true. Yeah, there might be, you can argue that there might be a better than average way to enjoy a thing, but at the end of the day, what you like is what you like, and that's okay.
Well, and I feel like there's definitely a big difference between like tasting and sampling something for that purpose as opposed to having a drink to enjoy it, right? Like, yes, if you're trying to taste the specifics of something, there's some protocol for that helps out.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
If you're just kicking back in your pajamas.
What's your favorite scotch? What's
Mine?
your favorite?
Ooh,
yeah.
Okay. It's gonna. I hope I don't butcher the name because I always butcher the name, but it's I think so. The brand Ardbeg. That's easy enough.
Right. Okay. I know Ardbeg.
I think it's Ugadal.
I know the one you're talking about.
That's currently my absolute favorite.
And I'm trying to think if I've had that. I have a regular bottle of Ardbeg downstairs, but I don't know that I've ever had the Ugdal. A buddy of mine is a big fan of that, though. And
if you like the briny side, then you'll love it. It's perfect.
I do. I enjoy that. My favorite go-to everyday one is probably like Bunnahabhain.
Okay, yeah.
But I love a good. I bought a bottle of Lagavulin when I sold the Fifth Ward. That was my celebration bottle, and then I've kept a bottle of that around ever since because I love how it's smoky and yet it's still so like smooth at the same time. It's not a harsh, punishing smokiness at all.
All right, Dale. It is last call here at the Indie Pub.
No.
Can you give a recommendation for an indie published book or two or three or however many that you think more people need to know about?
Okay. So probably the indie book that I would really love more people to read is The Deeds of Pounce by Benjamin Wachs. That's Wacs. It's published by Beating Windward Press, and it's basically about a goblin who goes to San Francisco and gets in all kinds of trouble.
That sounds awesome.
It's an awesome read. Beating Windward Press. I'm not just a little biased because they were the first ones to publish Doc Voodoo, and it was their inaugural title, but also because they have continued to put out really amazing eclectic stuff over the years. They've got a great book also called The Scottish Bitch. That is about, it's basically Macbeth in the world of drag queens. And that's just it. That's what they do. And they've got all kinds of wonderful creative nonfiction memoirs. They've got fantasy fiction. They've got a great book about the American fraternity world as like a corporate world. It's definitely, I think everybody needs to check out Beating Windward Press and see what they're putting out there because they do some amazing stuff.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, same question, but for any other media that you think people need to check out.
I think more folks need to read Tim Powers. His basic hallmark is secret history. He likes to take an actual event or period of time or group of people in history. He researches it scrupulously, and he sets himself the challenge of I won't change any facts, and then he comes up with some kind of crazy magical thing that's happening behind the scenes. He's got a number of books. They're all fantastic. My personal favorite is one called Declare, Declare, like the word declare. And it's basically like a John le Carré Cold War spy novel that deals with Jinn and Noah's Ark and this thing between like the British Secret Service and the Soviet Union, each trying to get control of this colony of Jinn on Mount Ararat.
Crazy.
Yes, it's just amazing. And but yeah, all of his stuff is wonderful. So everybody needs to read more Tim Powers.
All right, Dale. Tell everybody where they can find you, what you've got going on right now, any info you want to get out there.
All right. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. I have a blog, but I haven't updated it in 3 years. So you're welcome to look at that and see what I was thinking 3 years ago and before that. My books are available anywhere that books are sold and via online booksellers. Whether it's the Doc Voodoo series from Beating Windward Press, starting with Doc Voodoo Aces and Eights, or the Fifth Ward series from Orbit Books, starting with the Fifth Ward First Watch. I've also done one tie-in novel for Black Library, the Warhammer people. It's an Age of Sigmar novel called Realm Lords. I've done a few short stories for them, and I've got another novel in the works for them presently. So that'll probably be out next year sometime.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.